When I got that text message from my own son telling me I was just Dad's ex and had no claim to the company I helped build from nothing, my first reaction wasn't heartbreak. It was laughter. Because what my son didn't know, what nobody in our small Illinois town knew, was that I owned 60% of Miller Construction. Not his father. Not him. Me. My name is Dorothy Miller, but folks around here have called me Dot for all my 62 years. I'm sitting here in my little kitchen in Galesburg, Illinois. The same kitchen where I've made countless pots of coffee for construction crews, where I balanced the books that made us millionaires, and where I received the text that would change everything. If you're watching this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more real stories like mine. And if you see that hype button pop up, give it a click. It helps get these stories out to women who need to hear them. You see, for 35 years, I let everyone believe my ex-husband Chuck was the mastermind behind our construction empire. I stood in his shadow, smiled at company barbecues, and played the supportive wife while he took all the credit. Even after our divorce 3 years ago, I kept quiet. I let him and our son Jake run the business, collect the praise, and treat me like I was just some bitter ex-wife who didn't understand man's work. But here's what nobody knew. Back in 1989, when Chuck was just a small-time contractor drowning in debt, and I was a bookkeeper at the bank, I didn't just marry him. I saved him. With my inheritance from my grandmother, my business degree that everyone dismissed, and my name on every single legal document that mattered. The company wasn't built on Chuck's charm or Jake's muscles. It was built on my money, my mind, and my signature. That text message from Jake came on a Tuesday morning in October, just as the leaves were turning golden outside my window. Mom, stop calling about the Riverside project. Dad's company goes to me when he retires. You're just his ex now. Stay out of business, you don't understand. I set my coffee cup down and smiled. After 62 years of keeping the peace, it was time to remind my family exactly who they were dealing with. Because sometimes the most dangerous woman in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Growing up in Galesburg in the 1960s, I learned early that quiet women were praised and loud ones were problems. My mama Ruth worked double shifts at the canning factory while Daddy drove truck routes across the Midwest. We lived in a tiny house on Broad Street, where the railroad tracks reminded you every few hours that bigger things were moving through town, even if you weren't. Mama always said, "Dot, you got a head for numbers, but don't let it make you too big for your britches." She'd watch me do homework at our kitchen table, solving math problems faster than my older brother Tommy, and shake her head. "Smart women make men nervous, honey. Learn to let them think they're leading." Our house was the kind of place where every penny was counted twice. Daddy's trucking paycheck was steady but modest, and Mama's factory wages barely covered groceries. The wallpaper in our living room was older than I was, faded yellow roses that had seen better decades. But we had something more valuable than new furniture. We had work ethic and common sense. I watched Mama balance our household budget every Sunday after church, using a lined notebook and a stubby pencil. She could stretch $1 further than anyone I knew, making miracles happen with leftover pot roast and day-old bread from Morrison's Bakery. "Money's just numbers, Dot," she'd tell me. But knowing how to make numbers dance, that's power. By the time I was 16, I was keeping books for 3 local businesses: Murphy's Hardware, the Corner Cafe, and old Mr. Peterson's garage. Word got around that Ralph Murphy's daughter had a gift for making sense of receipts and finding money that others missed. I'd sit in those back offices after school, surrounded by shoebox accounting systems, turning chaos into order. The boys in my high school class were planning their futures around factory work or maybe college if they were lucky. But I had different dreams. I wanted to study business, maybe become an accountant, show the world that a girl from Railroad Town could make something of herself. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Henderson, encouraged me to apply to Western Illinois University. "You have the grades, Dorothy. Don't settle for less just because you're afraid to reach. But life has a way of changing your plans. The summer before my senior year, Daddy's truck broke down on Route 80, and the repair bills ate up my college fund. "We'll figure something else out, honey," he promised, but I could see the defeat in his eyes. Good, steady work was getting harder to find, and the factory was talking about layoffs. That's when I made my first real business decision. Instead of wallowing, I took a job at First National Bank of Galesburg, starting in the filing department but quickly moving up to junior bookkeeper. Mrs. Eleanor Hartman, the head teller, took me under her wing. "Banking isn't just about counting money, Dorothy," she'd say. "It's about understanding people's dreams and helping them build something solid." I learned more in 2 years at that bank than most people learn in college. I saw which businesses succeeded and which ones failed. I watched farmers lose their land because they didn't understand cash flow, and I saw smart entrepreneurs turn small loans into thriving enterprises. Most importantly, I learned that behind every successful business was someone who understood numbers, really understood them. My grandmother, Nana Rose, had always been the family's financial backbone. She'd saved every penny from her job at the telephone company, investing in war bonds and later real estate. When she passed away in 1987, she left me something unexpected, $42,000, and a piece of advice. "Don't marry for love alone, honey. Marry someone you can build something with." By then I was 25 and had been dating Chuck Miller, on and off for 2 years. Chuck was charming in that small-town way, tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and big dreams. He ran a small contracting business out of his garage, mostly doing handyman work and the occasional deck or bathroom remodel. He was talented with his hands, I'll give him that, but his books were a disaster. The first time I saw his accounting system, I nearly cried. Receipts shoved in coffee cans, invoices written on napkins, and a checkbook that hadn't been balanced in months. "I'm not good with paperwork," he'd admit with that boyish grin that made women forgive him for almost anything. "I'm better with hammers than calculators." Chuck had big dreams, though. He'd talk for hours about building custom homes, maybe even developing entire neighborhoods. "This town's growing, Dot," he'd say, gesturing toward the empty lots where new businesses were sprouting up. "People are going to need quality construction, and I want to be the guy they call." The problem was, Chuck's dreams were bigger than his bank account. He'd bid jobs too low, then struggle to make payroll. He'd start projects without proper permits, then scramble to fix problems that could have been avoided. By 1988, he was 3 months behind on his shop rent and fielding calls from angry suppliers. That's when he asked me to marry him. Not over a romantic dinner or during a sunset walk, but in my living room after he'd spent an hour explaining why his business was failing. "I need someone like you, Dot," he said, taking my hands in his work-roughened ones. "Someone who understands money and planning. We could build something amazing together." Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs. He wasn't asking me to be his wife. He was asking me to be his business partner with benefits. But I was 26, tired of living in my small apartment above the laundromat, and convinced that I could help him turn his potential into profit. So in March of 1989, I married Chuck Miller in a simple ceremony at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. My wedding gift to him wasn't china or silverware. It was Nana Rose's $42,000 and my business expertise. By our honeymoon, I was already sketching out plans to incorporate his business and expand his operation. I thought I was investing in our future together. I had no idea I was actually buying my way into 35 years of being invisible. The early years of Miller Construction felt like a partnership, even if the paperwork told a different story. I'd insisted that we incorporate the business properly, with official shares and legal protections. Chuck wanted to keep things simple. Just put everything in his name and call it a day. But I'd seen too many businesses fail because of poor legal structure. "Trust me on this, honey," I told him as we sat in lawyer Martin Brewster's office in downtown Galesburg. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Chuck fidgeted in his chair, clearly wanting to be anywhere but surrounded by legal documents. Dot, you're overthinking this. It's just a construction company, not some big corporation. But I insisted, and because my money was funding the expansion, Chuck eventually agreed. We structured Miller Construction as a corporation, with shares divided based on financial contribution and involvement. Since I was putting up the initial capital and would be handling all the business operations, I held 60%. Chuck, as the skilled tradesman and public face, held 40%. This protects both of us, I explained to him on the drive home. If something happens to one of us, the other person isn't left scrambling. And if the business takes off, we're both positioned to benefit. Chuck reached over and squeezed my hand. You're amazing, you know that? I never would have thought of half this stuff. Those first few years, I threw myself into making Miller Construction succeed. I got up at 5 every morning to make coffee and breakfast for whatever crew Chuck had hired. Then I'd drive to our new office, a rented space in the industrial district, and spend the day doing everything that didn't involve swinging a hammer. I handled the books, of course, but also much more. I wrote bids, managed schedules, dealt with suppliers, handled permits, and solved the hundreds of small problems that could derail a construction project. When the Riverside Shopping Center project came up for bid in 1991, I spent weeks preparing our proposal, researching every detail, and calculating margins down to the penny. We're not the biggest company bidding on this, I told Chuck over dinner, but we're going to be the smartest. Our bid won, and suddenly Miller Construction went from small-time handyman work to a $250,000 commercial project. I coordinated with subcontractors, managed the timeline, and handled the complex invoicing. Chuck supervised the actual construction, and his crews did beautiful work. But behind the scenes, I was the engine that kept everything running smoothly. The success of Riverside led to bigger projects. By 1995, we were building custom homes in the new Heritage Hills subdivision. By 2000, we had 12 full-time employees and were bidding on municipal projects. I'd transformed Chuck's garage-based operation into a $1 million company, but somewhere along the way, my role became invisible to everyone except me. It started small. At the company Christmas party in 1993, the mayor praised Chuck for building a business that employs good people and strengthens our community. No mention of the woman who wrote the bids, managed the finances, and made sure payroll never bounced. When the Galesburg Chronicle did a feature story on local entrepreneurs in 1998, they interviewed Chuck at the job site, photographing him in his hard hat and work boots. The article described him as a self-made businessman who built Miller Construction from nothing. I wasn't even mentioned, despite being the one who had literally built the company from nothing, my grandmother's inheritance, and my business knowledge. Chuck never corrected these oversights. In fact, he seemed to embrace them. At Chamber of Commerce meetings, he'd tell stories about taking risks and building something from scratch. He'd accept awards for business leadership and Entrepreneur of the Year, making speeches about hard work and determination. "Honey, you know I couldn't do any of this without you," he'd say, when I'd bring up feeling invisible. "Everyone who matters knows how important you are." But that wasn't true, and we both knew it. To the outside world, I was Chuck's wife who helped out with the books, a nice lady who made good coffee and remembered everyone's birthday, but not a real business owner, not someone who had turned a failing handyman operation into a regional construction powerhouse. The worst part was watching our son Jake absorb these assumptions. Born in 1992, Jake grew up thinking his father was some kind of business genius. He'd spend summers on job sites, learning to frame and finish, hearing stories about how Dad built this company with his own 2 hands. I'd try to share business lessons with Jake, explaining how to read a P&L statement or calculate project margins, but he'd get impatient. "Mom, I want to learn real construction stuff, not office work. By the time Jake was in high school, he'd completely bought into the narrative that construction was man's work and paperwork was woman's work. He'd come home from job sites full of stories about helping Dad with important decisions, never realizing that every major business decision went through me first. "Jake, your mother is the reason this company succeeds," Chuck would say sometimes, but it always sounded like an afterthought, like giving credit to the cook for a good meal. Appreciated, but not essential. The irony was that Chuck actually did need me more than ever as the business grew. By 2010, we were managing multiple projects simultaneously, dealing with complex subcontractor relationships and navigating new regulations. Chuck was a skilled contractor, but he was completely lost when it came to business strategy, financial planning, or legal compliance. I was the one who recognized that the 2008 recession created opportunities for companies that stayed smart and flexible. While other construction firms were laying off workers, I negotiated deals with suppliers, found creative financing for clients, and identified the renovation projects that would keep us busy while new construction slowed down. I was the one who pushed us to get certified for government contracts, opening up a whole new revenue stream. I was the one who researched new building technologies and sustainable construction methods that would differentiate us from competitors. But to everyone else, Miller Construction was Chuck's baby, and I was just along for the ride. By 2015, Jake was 23 and working full-time for the company. He'd graduated from trade school and was genuinely talented at construction management. But he'd also inherited his father's blind spot about the business side of things. "Why do we need all these spreadsheets and reports?" He'd complain when I'd try to involve him in planning meetings. "Dad built this company by doing good work, not by analyzing everything to death." I started to feel like a ghost in my own company. Chuck and Jake would make decisions about new equipment or personnel changes, then inform me after the fact. They'd take clients to lunch to discuss project details, leaving me to figure out the financial implications later. "It's just easier to handle some things man to man," Chuck would explain, when I'd point out that I wasn't being included in important conversations. "You know how contractors are. They want to talk to the guy in charge. The guy in charge." After 25 years of building the business side of Miller Construction, I was still seen as support staff in my own company. Things got worse after Chuck and I separated in 2020. We'd been having problems for years, growing apart as partners and spouses, but we'd tried to keep things civil for the sake of the business and our relationship with Jake. The divorce was finalized in early 2022, and Chuck moved out of our house to a new condo across town. We agreed that I'd continue handling the business operations while he focused on project management and client relations. In theory, it was a reasonable division of labor. In practice, it meant I became even more invisible. Without the social connection of being Chuck's wife, I stopped getting invited to industry events. Clients who used to chat with me at company gatherings now directed all their questions to Chuck or Jake. Suppliers who had worked with me for decades started treating me like a secretary rather than a decision-maker. "Mom, maybe it would be easier if you focused more on the office stuff and let us handle the client relationships," Jake suggested during one particularly frustrating week in 2023. "People just feel more comfortable dealing with Dad about construction decisions." I wanted to laugh, or cry, or shake my 29-year-old son until he understood that his mother had been making construction decisions since before he was born. Instead, I smiled and nodded and went back to my office to work on the quarterly reports that would show Miller Construction had just completed its most profitable year ever. Thanks to my strategic planning, cost management, and client development, we were approaching 8 figures in annual revenue. But according to my son, I should stick to office stuff and let the men handle the important decisions. That's when I started documenting everything. Not because I was planning anything dramatic, But because I realized that 35 years of institutional knowledge was living in my head, and nobody else seemed to think it mattered, I created detailed files on every major client, every successful project, every strategic decision that had driven our growth. I documented the relationships I'd built with suppliers, the financial strategies that had carried us through tough times, and the market analysis that guided our expansion decisions. It was like writing the history of a company that everyone else believed had been built by someone else. And then came that text message from Jake, dismissing me as just Dad's ex, who should stay out of business you don't understand. Sitting in my kitchen that Tuesday morning, staring at those words on my phone screen, I realized I had a choice. I could continue being invisible, letting my son and ex-husband write me out of the story I'd actually authored. Or I could remind them, and everyone else, exactly who owned Miller Construction. I finished my coffee, walked to my home office, and pulled out the corporate documents I'd filed 34 years earlier, the ones that clearly showed Dorothy Miller as the majority shareholder of Miller Construction, Inc. It was time for some people to learn the difference between running a company and owning it. The first thing I did was call Martin Brewster's law office. Martin had retired years ago, but his son David had taken over the practice and handled most of our legal work. I made an appointment for that afternoon, telling his secretary it was regarding corporate governance issues at Miller Construction. David Brewster was younger than Jake, but had inherited his father's careful attention to detail. When I walked into his office carrying a file folder of documents, he greeted me with the kind of polite confusion that had become familiar. "Mrs. Miller, I have to admit I'm a bit surprised to see you here. When you said corporate governance, I assumed Chuck would be coming in to discuss company structure changes." I sat down across from his mahogany desk and opened my folder. "David, I need you to review the original incorporation documents for Miller Construction and explain to me exactly what my rights are as majority shareholder." His eyebrows shot up. "I'm sorry. What do you mean by majority shareholder?" I slid the documents across his desk. When Chuck and I incorporated the business in 1989, I held 60% of the shares based on my initial capital investment and operational responsibilities. Chuck held 40%. I need to understand what that means legally, especially given our divorce. David studied the papers, his expression growing more serious with each page. "Mrs. Miller, are you telling me that you've been the majority owner of Miller Construction for 34 years? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And I'm also telling you that nobody else seems to remember that fact, including my ex-husband and my son." He leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the implications. "Have there been any changes to the corporate structure since 1989? Any transfer of shares or amendments to the Articles of Incorporation?" "Not that I'm aware of. And believe me, I would have been aware. I've handled all the corporate paperwork since day one." David spent the next hour walking me through my rights and responsibilities as majority shareholder. The picture that emerged was both empowering and sobering. Legally, I had the authority to make major corporate decisions, remove officers, and even dissolve the company if necessary. But exercising those rights would require careful planning and professional legal support. "Mrs. Miller, this is a significant situation," David said finally. "If what you're telling me is accurate, you've essentially been allowing your minority shareholders to operate the company without proper oversight for decades." "I wasn't allowing anything, David. I was working my tail off to build this business, while everyone else got the credit." He nodded thoughtfully. "The question now is what you want to do about it. Are you looking to assert more operational control? Are you considering selling your shares? Or is this about ensuring proper recognition of your ownership?" I had been asking myself the same question since receiving Jake's text message. "I'm not sure yet, but I want to understand all my options before I decide on anything." David recommended a full corporate audit to confirm the current ownership structure and ensure all records were properly maintained. He also suggested that we schedule a formal shareholder meeting to address any governance issues that had developed over the years. "One more thing," I said as I prepared to leave. "I'd prefer to keep this confidential for now. I want to have all my facts straight before I discuss this with Chuck or Jake." "Of course. Attorney-client privilege covers everything we've discussed." Driving home from David's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of control over my own destiny. For too long, I had allowed other people to define my role in the company I had built. That was about to change. The next few days were spent gathering documentation. I pulled together 34 years of corporate filings, tax returns, financial statements, and board resolutions. What I discovered was both enlightening and infuriating. There was no evidence of any formal transfer of my shares, no board resolutions authorizing changes to corporate leadership, no documentation explaining why Chuck and Jake had been making unilateral decisions about company operations. In other words, they had been running Miller Construction like they owned it, despite having no legal authority to do so. I also reviewed our recent financial performance, and what I found was impressive. Despite the informal management structure, Miller Construction was thriving. We had completed 42 projects in the past year, with revenues approaching $12 million. Our profit margins were healthy, our client satisfaction ratings were excellent, and our safety record was outstanding. I had built something to be proud of, even if no one else recognized my contribution. The tipping point came the following Monday when I arrived at the office to find Chuck and Jake meeting with the owner of Heritage Hills Development about a potential 50-unit housing project. This was exactly the kind of major deal that could set our company's direction for the next 2 years, and they hadn't even mentioned it to me. I knocked on the conference room door and stepped inside. "Gentlemen, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Jim Morrison from Heritage Hills looked confused. "Oh, hello, Dot. I didn't realize you'd be joining us." "Well, Jim, since this involves a major strategic decision for Miller Construction, I thought the majority shareholder should probably be present." The silence in the room was deafening. Chuck's face went pale, and Jake looked like he'd been slapped. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Jake said finally. I smiled sweetly and took a seat at the conference table. "I'm talking about the fact that I own 60% of this company, which makes me the majority shareholder and technically the person who should be approving any major contracts." Jim Morrison looked around the table uncertainly. "Maybe I should come back when you folks have sorted out your internal issues." "That might be wise, Jim," I said. "We'll call you once we've clarified our corporate governance structure." After Jim left, Chuck and Jake stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Dot, what the hell has gotten into you?" Chuck demanded. "What's gotten into me is that I'm tired of being treated like a secretary in my own company. What's gotten into me is receiving a text from my son telling me to stay out of business I don't understand, when I understand this business better than anyone in this room." Jake's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. "Dad, we need to deal with this Heritage Hills situation. They're expecting an answer by Friday." "The Heritage Hills situation will wait," I said firmly. "What we need to deal with is the fact that you two have been operating this company without proper authorization from the majority shareholder." Chuck leaned forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "Honey, I know you're upset about the divorce and feeling left out, but this isn't the way to handle it. The company is doing fine. Why rock the boat? The company is doing fine because I've been working my ass off for 34 years to make sure it does fine. And I'm not rocking the boat, Chuck. I'm taking the wheel of a ship I've been navigating from the engine room while you stood on deck waving to the crowd." Jake stood up abruptly. "This is crazy, Mom. Dad built this company. You helped, sure, but I didn't help, Jake. I built it. With my money, my business knowledge, and my 60-hour weeks for 3 decades. Your father contributed his construction skills, which are valuable, but the business itself? The strategy, the growth, the financial management. That was me. I could see them both struggling to process this information. Their entire understanding of Miller Construction's history was being challenged, and they didn't know how to respond. I want a complete management review of this company, I continued. I want clear job descriptions, proper reporting structures, and formal board oversight. I want to be included in every major decision, not informed about them after the fact. Chuck's jaw tightened. And if we don't agree to this, power grab? I stood up and gathered my things. It's not a power grab, Chuck. It's a power recovery. And this isn't a negotiation. I'm the majority shareholder, which means I have the legal authority to make these changes with or without your agreement. As I walked toward the door, I turned back to face them. Oh, and boys, the Heritage Hills project? I've been analyzing their financial situation and their leverage to the hilt. Their last 2 projects went over budget and behind schedule. If we take that contract, we'll be lucky to break even. I left them sitting in stunned silence and went back to my office to call David Brewster. It was time to make this official. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of legal documentation and corporate reorganization. David helped me draft formal notices to all shareholders about an upcoming board meeting to address governance issues. He also prepared resolutions that would clarify management roles and establish proper oversight procedures. Chuck tried to play it off as my post-divorce emotional phase, but I could see the worry in his eyes. Jake alternated between anger and confusion, clearly struggling to reconcile his image of his father as company founder with the legal realities of my ownership. The confrontation I'd been dreading came on a Thursday evening when Jake showed up at my house. Mom, we need to talk about this company situation. I invited him in and made coffee, the same way I'd done when he was a teenager with girlfriend problems or college stress. But this conversation was going to be different. Jake, do you remember when you were little and you'd come to the office with me on Saturdays? He nodded. You'd let me use the copy machine and play with the calculator. Do you remember what I was doing while you played? Office stuff. Paperwork. I sighed. That office stuff was running a business, honey. I was preparing bids, managing cash flow, coordinating with suppliers, handling client relationships. I was doing everything that kept Miller Construction operating and growing. Jake shifted uncomfortably. But Dad was doing the real work, the construction. Construction is important, Jake. Your father is talented at what he does. But construction without business management is just expensive labor. Anyone can swing a hammer. Not everyone can turn hammering into a profitable, sustainable company. I could see him struggling with this concept. His entire identity was built around the idea that he was following in his father's footsteps. As a builder, the possibility that his mother was the actual architect of the family business threatened everything he believed about himself. So, what happens now? He asked finally. Now we run this company the right way, with proper oversight, clear responsibilities, and mutual respect for everyone's contributions. Your construction skills are valuable, Jake, but they're not more valuable than business expertise, and they don't give you the right to dismiss the people who handle the parts of the business you don't understand. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about the ownership thing? Because I hoped I wouldn't have to. I hoped that my son would grow up respecting all kinds of work, including the work his mother did. I hoped that when you inherited leadership of this company, you'd value the business side as much as the construction side. And I screwed that up. We all screwed it up, honey. Your father and I let you grow up with a false understanding of how this business really works. That's on us, not you. Jake left that night with a lot to think about. Chuck was less receptive to soul-searching, but he couldn't argue with the legal documents David had prepared. Ready or not, Miller Construction was about to have real corporate governance for the first time in 3 decades. The formal board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. It would be the first time in my adult life that I would walk into Miller Construction as the acknowledged majority shareholder, with the legal authority to back up my business decisions. I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. After 34 years of being invisible, I was about to become impossible to ignore. The weekend before our board meeting, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went shopping for a power suit. Not the comfortable cardigans and slacks I usually wore to the office, but a real, honest-to-goodness business suit that would make people take notice. At Macy's in Peoria, I found a charcoal gray suit with a jacket that fit like it was tailored for me. The saleswoman, probably in her 30s, helped me pick out a silk blouse in deep blue and a pair of low heels that looked professional without being intimidating. "Special occasion?" she asked as I studied myself in the dressing room mirror. "You could say that. I'm taking control of my company." She grinned. "Then you need to look like someone who means business." Looking at my reflection, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. For 34 years, I'd dressed like someone who worked for Miller Construction. Now I was dressing like someone who owned it. Sunday evening, I spread all my documentation across my dining room table and began preparing for what I knew would be the most important business meeting of my life. David Brewster had helped me draft an agenda that would cover corporate governance, management structure, and strategic planning. But I knew the real challenge wouldn't be the legal technicalities. It would be changing 3 decades of established relationships and assumptions. I started by writing down my specific goals for the meeting. First, I wanted formal recognition of my majority shareholder status and the rights that came with it. Second, I wanted to establish clear management roles that reflected both ownership structure and individual expertise. Third, I wanted to create a path forward that would allow Chuck and Jake to continue contributing their construction skills while respecting my business leadership. Most importantly, I wanted to do all of this without destroying the family relationships that mattered to me. Despite everything, Chuck was still Jake's father and my partner of many years. Jake was still my son, even if he'd forgotten who had taught him his work ethic. I didn't want to win a corporate battle by losing my family, but I also wasn't going to continue being invisible in my own company. I spent hours that Sunday evening preparing responses to every argument I thought Chuck and Jake might raise. They'd probably claim that the original ownership structure was just paperwork, that Chuck's construction expertise was the real foundation of the company. They might argue that my business degree from 35 years ago wasn't relevant to modern construction management. Jake might even suggest that generational change was natural, and that I should consider stepping back to let younger leadership take over. I had answers for all of these arguments, backed up by financial data, industry analysis, and 3 decades of proven results. But more than that, I had something they couldn't dispute: legal ownership of the company we were all fighting over. Monday morning, I arrived at the Miller Construction office at 7:30, an hour before our scheduled meeting. I wanted time to set up the conference room properly and review my materials one final time. The early morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed symbolic somehow. A new day for an old company. I arranged copies of the corporate documents at each place around the conference table. David Brewster would be attending as corporate counsel to ensure everything was handled properly. I'd also invited our accountant, Margaret Foster, who had been handling our books for 15 years and understood the financial complexity of what we'd built. Chuck arrived first, looking uncomfortable in a dress shirt and tie. He rarely dressed up for business meetings, preferring his usual work clothes and company polo shirt. Today felt different, and we both knew it. "Morning, Dot. You look official." "Thank you. That's the idea." Jake arrived a few minutes later with David and Margaret. As everyone took their seats, I could feel the tension in the room. This wasn't going to be one of our usual, informal discussions about project schedules and equipment purchases. "Before we begin," I said, standing at the head of the conference table, "I want everyone to understand that this meeting is being conducted under formal corporate governance procedures. David is here as legal counsel. Margaret is here as our financial advisor. And we're going to address some issues that should have been resolved years ago. I opened the folder in front of me and pulled out the original incorporation documents. Chuck, Jake, I know this information will be surprising to you, but according to the legal structure of Miller Construction, I am the majority shareholder with 60% ownership. This has been the case since we incorporated in 1989. The silence that followed was deafening. Chuck stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. Jake's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally what looked like embarrassment. David cleared his throat. I've reviewed all the corporate filings, and Mrs. Miller's ownership position is clearly documented and has never been legally modified. What does this mean exactly? Jake asked quietly. Margaret opened her laptop and pulled up a financial summary. It means your mother has been the majority owner of a company that generated $11.8 million in revenue last year and currently has net assets of approximately $4.2 million. Chuck leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to process this information. Dot, I don't understand. We built this company together. Why are you making it sound like you did everything? I'm not saying I did everything, Chuck. Your construction expertise and leadership of our field crews has been essential to our success. But the business strategy, financial management, client development, and operational oversight, the things that turned your construction skills into a multi-million-dollar company, those were my contributions. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. Let me show you exactly what I mean. For the next 30 minutes, I walked them through the history of Miller Construction from a business perspective. I showed them how my initial capital investment had funded our first major equipment purchases. I explained how my bid preparation and project management had won us the contracts that established our reputation. I demonstrated how my financial planning had carried us through economic downturns and positioned us for growth during recovery periods. In 1995, when the Riverside project went over budget, who restructured our supplier agreements to maintain profitability? I asked. Chuck was quiet. In 2001, when the Henderson contract fell through at the last minute, who found replacement work to keep 12 employees from being laid off? Jake shifted uncomfortably. In 2008, when the recession hit and construction work dried up, who identified the renovation and repair opportunities that kept us busy while other companies were folding? Margaret nodded approvingly. Your mother's financial management during that period was exceptional. Most construction companies lost money in 2008 and 2009. Miller Construction actually grew. And in 2016, when we expanded into commercial work, who researched the market, developed our capabilities, and built the relationships that now account for 40% of our revenue? By now, both Chuck and Jake were staring at the whiteboard covered with facts and figures that told a very different story than the one they'd been believing. The point isn't to minimize anyone's contributions, I continued. Chuck, your construction expertise is valuable and essential. Jake, your project management skills and client relationships are important to our continued success. But this company succeeded because it combined construction expertise with business expertise. And for 34 years, I've been providing the business expertise while everyone else got credit for the results. David pulled out a legal pad covered with notes. Moving forward, we need to establish a corporate structure that reflects both ownership percentages and operational responsibilities. Mrs. Miller, as majority shareholder, you have the legal authority to make executive decisions, but it would be beneficial to create a management structure that utilizes everyone's strengths. I had spent considerable time thinking about this exact issue. Here's what I propose. I'll assume the role of Chief Executive Officer, with responsibility for strategic planning, financial management, and overall corporate governance. Chuck, I'd like you to serve as Chief Operating Officer, overseeing all construction operations, crew management, and quality control. Jake, you can be promoted to Vice President of Project Management, handling client relationships and day-to-day project coordination. Chuck looked skeptical. So you'd be our boss? I'd be the CEO of a company I've always owned but never officially led. You'd be the COO of a company where you've always excelled at construction operations. The difference is that now our roles would reflect both our ownership positions and our actual responsibilities. Jake raised his hand tentatively. What about decision-making? Who gets to decide about new equipment, hiring, major contracts? I smiled. Major strategic decisions would require board approval, where I hold the controlling vote. But operational decisions within your areas of responsibility would be yours to make. Chuck, if you think we need a new excavator, you'd have the authority to purchase it within budget parameters. Jake, if a client wants to modify a project scope, you'd handle the negotiation and change orders. Margaret pulled up another spreadsheet. This structure would also allow us to formalize compensation in a way that reflects both ownership and contribution. Mrs. Miller would receive a CEO's salary plus dividends based on her 60% ownership. Chuck and Jake would receive management salaries plus performance bonuses tied to operational metrics. The room was quiet for several minutes while everyone absorbed this information. Finally, Chuck spoke up. Dot, I owe you an apology. I guess I never really understood how much you contributed to building this business. Jake nodded slowly. Mom, I'm sorry about that text message. I was way out of line. I felt tears beginning to form, but I blinked them back. Thank you both, but apologies aren't enough anymore. I need formal recognition of my role and authority to make the decisions necessary to keep this company growing. David pulled out a set of documents he'd prepared. I've drafted corporate resolutions that would formalize the management structure we've discussed. If everyone agrees, we can make these changes official today. Over the next hour, we went through each document line by line. Chuck and Jake asked good questions about reporting relationships, decision-making authority, and performance expectations. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, they both seemed genuinely interested in making the new structure work. The breakthrough moment came when Jake asked about long-term succession planning. Mom, I know I screwed up by assuming I'd just inherit the company, but I'd still like to be involved in Miller Construction's future. What would that look like under this new structure? I had been hoping he'd ask that question. Jake, you're talented and you care about this business. If you prove yourself in the VP role and continue developing your business skills, there's no reason you couldn't eventually become CEO. But that would happen through professional development and board approval, not through assumption or inheritance. And Dad, your father has skills and experience that would be difficult to replace. As long as he wants to be part of Miller Construction, there's a place for him here. Chuck extended his hand across the conference table. Partners? I shook it firmly. Partners, with clearly defined roles and mutual respect. By the end of the meeting, we had signed corporate resolutions establishing new management structure, updated our articles of incorporation to reflect current ownership, and created a strategic plan for the next 5 years. For the first time in the company's history, Miller Construction had a real board of directors, proper governance procedures, and management accountability. But more than that, I had finally stepped out of the shadows and claimed my rightful place as the leader of the company I had built. Walking to my car that afternoon, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of being invisible, of having my contributions dismissed and my expertise ignored, was finally lifting. I wasn't just the woman who helped with the books anymore. I was Dorothy Miller, CEO of Miller Construction, majority shareholder of a multimillion-dollar company. That evening I called my best friend Helen, who had been listening to me complain about feeling undervalued for decades. Helen, you're not going to believe what happened today. Try me. I just took over my own company. She laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Honey, it's about damn time. The transformation of Miller Construction didn't happen overnight, but the changes were immediate and dramatic. Within a week of our board meeting, word had spread throughout Galsburg's business community that Dorothy Miller was now officially running the construction company everyone had assumed belonged to her ex-husband. The reactions were fascinating and varied. Some people, particularly other business owners who had worked with me over the years, seemed relieved that the company's real leadership was finally being acknowledged. I always wondered why Chuck got all the credit when you clearly knew more about the business side, said Tom Morrison from Morrison's Hardware. Others were less supportive. At the Chamber of Commerce meeting the following Thursday, I overheard Larry Peterson from Peterson's Plumbing tell someone, "It's a shame when a woman can't let her ex-husband run his own business in peace." I walked over to Larry with my brightest smile. "Good evening, Larry. I heard you mention Chuck's business, but I think there might be some confusion. Miller Construction is actually my business. I'm the majority owner and CEO. Chuck handles our field operations, and he does excellent work." Larry's face turned red, but he didn't have much to say in response. The most interesting reactions came from our clients and suppliers. Jim Morrison from Heritage Hills Development called me directly to apologize for the confusion during our previous meeting and to discuss the housing project with the company's actual decision-maker. After reviewing their financial situation more thoroughly, I politely declined their proposal, a decision that proved wise when Heritage Hills filed for bankruptcy 6 months later. Our suppliers, many of whom had been working with me for years, seemed delighted to finally have official recognition of our relationship. Sarah Jenkins from Midwest Lumber called to congratulate me on my new title and to discuss a volume discount program she'd been wanting to propose. "Dorothy, I've been dealing with you on major purchases for 15 years, she said. "It's nice to finally know I was talking to the right person all along." The biggest changes, though, were internal. Chuck threw himself into his new role as COO with enthusiasm that surprised me. Without the pressure of trying to manage aspects of the business he'd never fully understood, he seemed more relaxed and confident. His focus on construction quality and crew management improved noticeably, and our job site efficiency increased by almost 15% within the first month. Jake's adjustment was more challenging. At 29, he'd spent his entire adult life believing he was destined to inherit his father's construction empire. Learning that his mother was actually the founder and majority owner required a complete recalibration of his self-image and career expectations. But to his credit, Jake approached his new role as VP of Project Management with genuine commitment to learning. He started asking me questions about financial analysis, market research, and strategic planning, subjects he'd previously dismissed as office work. "Mom, can you show me how you evaluate whether a potential project will be profitable?" he asked during our first formal management meeting. "Of course, but why the sudden interest?" He looked slightly embarrassed. "Because I realized I've been making decisions about projects without really understanding the business implications. That's not fair to you, Dad, or our employees." Over the following months, I began training Jake in aspects of business management he'd never been exposed to. We worked together on bid preparation, cost analysis, and client relationship management. I showed him how to read financial statements, evaluate cash flow, and assess market trends. What I discovered was that Jake had inherited more of my analytical abilities than either of us had realized. Once he started paying attention to the business side of construction, he quickly grasped concepts that had taken me years to master. "You know, Jake, you have real potential as a business leader," I told him after he'd successfully negotiated a complex contract modification that saved us both time and money. "I never thought I was smart enough for business stuff. Intelligence isn't the issue. Interest and effort are what matter. And you're definitely capable of both." The formal recognition of my role also opened doors that had been closed for decades. I was invited to join the board of the Galesburg Economic Development Council, something that had never been offered when I was seen as Chuck's wife, rather than a business owner in my own right. I started speaking at regional business conferences about entrepreneurship and family business management. The Illinois Small Business Association asked me to mentor other women who were trying to grow construction and manufacturing companies. Mrs. Miller, how did you manage to build such a successful business in a male-dominated industry? A young woman asked after one of my presentations. I didn't manage to do anything, I replied. I just did it. And then I spent 30 years letting other people take credit for it. Don't make that mistake. The financial results of our organizational changes were impressive. With clear management roles and better communication between construction and business operations, our project completion times improved, and our profit margins increased. We landed 3 major contracts in the first quarter after restructuring, including a municipal project that would keep us busy for 18 months. But the personal satisfaction was even more rewarding. For the first time in my adult life, I was getting credit for my actual contributions to our family's success. Clients called me directly to discuss projects. Suppliers negotiated deals with me as the decision-maker. Industry publications interviewed me about market trends and business strategy. At the annual Knox County Business Awards ceremony, Miller Construction received recognition for growth and innovation. When they called my name as CEO to accept the award, I walked to the podium with my head held high. This award belongs to everyone at Miller Construction, I said, looking out at an audience that included Chuck and Jake. But I want to especially thank the construction professionals who trusted a bookkeeper from Galesburg to help them build something lasting. The applause was genuine and sustained. In the audience, I could see Chuck and Jake beaming with pride. Not pride in what they had accomplished, but pride in what I had accomplished. After the ceremony, Jake came up to me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I'm so proud of you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you've been doing all these years. Chuck was waiting nearby. Dot, I always knew you were smart. I just never realized how smart. Thank you for building something we can all be proud of. That night, driving home through the familiar streets of Galesburg, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The town looked the same. The railroad tracks still divided the north and south sides. Morrison's Hardware still had the same crooked awning. The corner cafe still served the best pie in Knox County. But everything was different because I was different. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't minimizing my contributions or letting other people define my worth. I was Dorothy Miller, CEO, majority shareholder, and the woman who had built Miller Construction from a failing handyman business into a regional construction leader. The best part was that this transformation hadn't cost me my family relationships. Chuck and I would never reconcile as spouses, but we had found a way to be effective business partners and co-parents. Jake and I were closer than we'd been since he was a teenager, bonded by shared respect for the business we were building together. 6 months after our board meeting, Jake came to me with a proposal. Mom, I've been thinking about long-term strategy for Miller Construction. What if we expanded into sustainable construction and green building techniques? I've been researching solar integration and energy-efficient building methods. I smiled. Jake, that's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that will serve you well as a future business leader. Let's develop a full proposal and present it to the board. You mean I get to present to the board? As VP of Project Management, strategic planning is part of your job description, but I'll be there to support you. Watching my son prepare his first formal business presentation, I felt the same pride I'd experienced when he'd learned to ride a bike or graduated from high school. But this was different. This was professional pride in a young man who was finally understanding that building a business requires the same careful planning and skilled execution as building a house. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't destroying the people who had underestimated me. It was succeeding so completely that they had no choice but to acknowledge my capabilities and contributions. At 62, I was finally living as the person I'd always been, but had never been allowed to be. And Miller Construction was thriving under leadership that recognized all forms of expertise, not just the kind that involved hammers and hard hats. Sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is simply refuse to be invisible any longer. The ripple effects of my corporate takeover extended far beyond Miller Construction's conference room. Within 6 months, our story had spread throughout the construction industry in central Illinois and beyond. I started receiving invitations to speak at women's business conferences, construction industry events, and even academic symposiums about entrepreneurship and family business dynamics. The most meaningful response came from other women who had been supporting family businesses from behind the scenes. I received letters and emails from wives, daughters, and sisters who had been providing crucial business expertise, while their male relatives received public recognition. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a woman named Patricia Kowalski in Springfield, whose family had owned a landscaping business for 20 years. Mrs. Miller, I read about your situation in the Illinois Business Journal. I've been doing the books, managing schedules, and handling customer service for my husband's landscaping company since 1998. Last week, he told a reporter that he'd built the business from nothing with hard work and determination. I wanted to ask you, how did you find the courage to speak up? I called Patricia directly. Honey, I found the courage when I realized that staying silent was hurting not just me, but the business I'd worked so hard to build. When my contributions were invisible, important decisions were being made without critical information. 6 months later, Patricia sent me another letter. She'd used my story as inspiration to formalize her role in Kowalski Landscaping. Her husband had initially resisted, but when Patricia presented him with documentation of her contributions and a plan for improving their operations, he recognized the value of official partnership. These stories reinforced something I'd suspected but hadn't fully understood. There were thousands of women like me, building businesses while remaining invisible, contributing expertise while letting others take credit. The personal changes in my life were equally significant. For the first time since my 20s, I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what was expected of me. I enrolled in a strategic management program at Western Illinois University, updating my business education for the modern economy. At 62, I was the oldest student in most of my classes, but I was also often the most experienced. Mrs. Miller, my professor asked during a case study discussion, how would you handle this succession planning challenge? Well, in my company, we're addressing exactly this issue by separating ownership from management and creating clear criteria for leadership development. The younger students were fascinated by real-world applications of the theories they were studying. I found myself becoming an unofficial mentor to several young women who were planning careers in business. My relationship with Jake continued to evolve in ways that surprised both of us. As he developed genuine business skills, our conversations became more collaborative and strategic. He stopped seeing me as mom who handles the paperwork and started recognizing me as a seasoned executive with valuable expertise. I've been thinking about our expansion into commercial construction, Jake said during one of our weekly planning meetings. What if we specialized in projects that require complex permitting and regulatory compliance? That's where our business expertise gives us a real competitive advantage. I was impressed. That's excellent strategic thinking. Most construction companies try to avoid regulatory complexity, but if we embrace it, we could charge premium rates for projects other companies won't touch. Chuck's evolution was more gradual but equally meaningful. Without the pressure of trying to manage business functions he'd never mastered, he became more confident and effective in his construction leadership role. Our crews respected him more because he was clearly operating in his area of expertise, rather than struggling with tasks outside his comfort zone. Dot, I need to tell you something, Chuck said during one of our monthly management reviews. I spent 30 years feeling like I was failing at parts of this business. I didn't understand the financial side, and I was afraid to admit it. Having clear roles makes me better at what I actually do well. Chuck, you were never failing. We just had unclear expectations and poor communication. This structure works better for everyone. The financial performance of Miller Construction under its new management structure exceeded all my projections. With improved coordination between construction and business operations, our project efficiency increased by 25%. Our bid success rate improved because Jake's enhanced business understanding allowed him to present more compelling proposals to clients. Most importantly, our reputation in the industry evolved from reliable construction company to strategic construction partner. Clients began coming to us not just for building services, but for construction consulting and project development expertise. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some longtime clients were confused by the management changes, and a few expressed discomfort dealing with a woman as the primary decision-maker. We lost 2 small contracts because clients insisted on working directly with the owner, meaning Chuck, and weren't satisfied when we explained the actual ownership structure. But for every client we lost, we gained 2 who specifically wanted to work with a company that had strong business leadership. Our reputation for financial stability, strategic planning, and professional management attracted larger, more profitable projects. The most satisfying moment came 18 months after our restructuring, when Miller Construction was selected for the largest municipal project in Galesburg's history, a $12 million renovation of the city's water treatment facility. Mrs. Miller, the city manager told me when announcing our selection, your company's proposal demonstrated the kind of comprehensive planning and financial analysis that gives us confidence in successful project completion. Standing in the city council chambers, listening to our selection being announced, I thought about all the years I'd attended similar meetings as Chuck's wife, watching him receive recognition for successes I'd helped create. This time, I was there as Dorothy Miller, CEO, being recognized for strategic leadership and business expertise. Jake was in the audience, beaming with pride. After the meeting, he came up to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just love or respect, but professional admiration. Mom, that was incredible. You commanded that room like you were born to lead these kinds of meetings. Thank you, honey. But you know what? I was born to lead these meetings. It just took me 62 years to start doing it publicly. The personal growth extended beyond business success. I started traveling for the first time in decades, attending conferences and visiting other construction companies to learn about industry best practices. I joined a hiking group, took up painting, and began learning Spanish. All the things I'd postponed while building a business and raising a family suddenly became possible again. My social life expanded as well. As a recognized business leader rather than someone's ex-wife, I was included in professional networks and community organizations that had previously been closed to me. I developed friendships with other women entrepreneurs, creating support systems I'd never had during my years of invisible contribution. The most unexpected benefit was the impact on my relationship with Jake's future. At 31, Jake was seriously dating a young woman named Amanda, who worked as a financial analyst for a regional bank. When Amanda learned about my background and experience, she sought me out for career advice. Mrs. Miller, I'm thinking about starting my own consulting firm. As a woman in finance, what advice would you give me about building credibility with clients? Amanda, the most important thing is to document your expertise and results. Don't let anyone minimize your contributions or dismiss your knowledge. And don't wait for permission to be taken seriously. Just insist on it. Watching Amanda and Jake discuss business ideas and career plans, I realized that my transformation had created positive ripple effects for the next generation. Jake was learning to value different types of expertise and to see women as equal business partners. Amanda was seeing an example of late-career entrepreneurship and leadership that might influence her own professional choices. 2 years after taking control of Miller Construction, I decided to write a book about invisible women in family businesses. Hidden Founders, the women who build America's businesses, became a regional bestseller and led to speaking engagements across the Midwest. The research for the book revealed that my experience was far from unique. Academic studies estimated that 30 to 40% of family businesses included significant contributions from women who held no official recognition or authority. These women were often spouses, daughters, or sisters who provided crucial business services, while male family members received credit for company success. My book included interviews with women in construction, manufacturing, agriculture, and service industries who had similar stories of invisible contribution and eventual recognition. The common themes were remarkable: women providing financial management, customer relations, strategic planning, and operational oversight while being categorized as helpers rather than leaders. But the book also included stories of successful transitions like mine, where families had learned to recognize all contributions and create management structures that reflected actual roles and expertise. The goal isn't to diminish anyone's contributions, I wrote in the conclusion. It's to acknowledge all contributions and create business structures that utilize everyone's strengths effectively. The book's success led to consulting opportunities with other family businesses facing similar challenges. I developed a practice helping families clarify ownership structures, define management roles, and create succession plans that considered all forms of contribution. One of my favorite consulting projects involved a family restaurant chain where 3 sisters had been managing different aspects of the business while their brother received recognition as the restaurant owner. After working with them for 6 months, they restructured as equal partners with clearly defined responsibilities. Their revenues increased by 40% within a year. These experiences reinforced my belief that recognizing invisible contributions isn't just about fairness, it's about business effectiveness. Companies perform better when all expertise is acknowledged and utilized. As I approached my 65th birthday, I started thinking about my own succession planning at Miller Construction. Jake had developed into an effective business leader, but he still had areas where he needed more experience. I decided to create a 5-year transition plan that would gradually increase his responsibilities while ensuring the business knowledge I'd accumulated over 3 decades wouldn't be lost. Jake, I want you to understand that becoming CEO isn't just about inheriting a title, I told him during one of our planning sessions. It's about accepting responsibility for every person who depends on this company for their livelihood. I understand, Mom, and I want to earn the role the right way. The transition plan included formal business education for Jake, mentorship relationships with other CEOs, and gradual assumption of strategic planning responsibilities. By the time I retired, he would have the business expertise to match his construction knowledge, but I also insisted on maintaining my majority ownership until Jake demonstrated sustained, effective leadership. This company will always be more than a family legacy, I explained. It's a business that serves clients, employs people, and contributes to our community. Those responsibilities are more important than family tradition. 3 years after my corporate takeover, Miller Construction was featured on the cover of Midwest Construction magazine as one of the region's fastest-growing companies. The article focused on our innovative management structure and strategic planning capabilities. Miller Construction represents the future of family businesses, the article concluded. By recognizing all forms of expertise and creating management structures that reflect actual contributions, They've positioned themselves for sustained growth and success. Reading that article in my office, surrounded by the awards and recognitions I'd earned over the past 3 years, I felt a satisfaction I'd never experienced during my invisible decades. Not just because I was finally getting credit, but because Miller Construction was thriving under leadership that valued all types of contribution. The best part was knowing that other women were following similar paths. My story had become part of a larger conversation about invisible contributions and family business dynamics. Women across the country were stepping out of shadows and claiming recognition for their business expertise. Sometimes the most powerful revolution is simply refusing to accept invisibility any longer. Looking back now, I realize that taking control of Miller Construction wasn't just about correcting a business injustice. It was about reclaiming my own identity after decades of letting other people define who I was and what I was worth. At 67, I'm no longer the CEO of Miller Construction. Jake earned that promotion 2 years ago, after demonstrating the kind of comprehensive business leadership that our company requires. But I remain the majority shareholder and chairman of the board, providing strategic oversight while Jake handles day-to-day operations. The transition has been everything I hoped for. Jake now understands that building a successful business requires the same careful planning, skilled execution, and attention to detail as building a house. He values financial analysis as much as construction quality, and he's surrounded himself with advisors who complement his strengths. Chuck is still our chief operating officer, and at 71, he's as committed to quality construction as ever. He's also become one of my strongest advocates, often telling clients and suppliers, if you want to understand why Miller Construction is successful, you need to talk to Dorothy. She's the one who built this business. Ta-da! The personal satisfaction of being recognized for my contributions is immense, but the professional impact has been even more meaningful. Miller Construction now employs 47 people, generates annual revenues approaching $20 million, and has completed projects in 4 states. We are recognized as one of the leading construction companies in the Midwest, known for our financial stability, strategic planning, and innovative management practices. But beyond the business success, I'm proud of the cultural change we've created. Young women who work for Miller Construction see examples of female leadership and business expertise. Jake's marriage to Amanda has brought another strong woman into our family business, and she's already contributing marketing and financial analysis skills that enhance our capabilities. The ripple effects continue to spread. My book has sold over 50,000 copies and been translated into 3 languages. I receive emails weekly from women around the world who have used my story as inspiration to claim recognition for their own business contributions. Last month, I spoke at a conference in Chicago about women in construction and family business dynamics. After my presentation, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Miller, I've been managing the business side of my family's electrical contracting company for 8 years, while my father and brothers get all the credit. Your story gives me hope that I can change that dynamic." "Honey," I told her, "you don't need hope. You need documentation, legal advice, and the courage to insist on what you've earned. If I can do it at 62, you can certainly do it at 32. The lessons I've learned through this journey extend far beyond business management. I've learned that invisible contributions often remain invisible because we allow them to. That recognition rarely comes automatically. It must be claimed and defended. That family dynamics can change, even after decades of established patterns. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to become the person you've always been, but never been allowed to be. For 62 years, I was the woman who helped with the business, who supported her husband's dreams, who assisted with the success that other people achieved. Now I'm the woman who built a multi-million-dollar company, who employs dozens of families, who changed the way an entire industry thinks about women's contributions to family businesses. The difference isn't in what I did. I was always doing the same work, making the same contributions, creating the same value. The difference is in how that work is recognized, valued, and credited. If you're watching this video and you recognize yourself in my story, if you're the woman behind a family business who never gets recognition for your contributions, I want you to know that change is possible. It requires courage, planning, and sometimes difficult conversations with people you love. But the alternative is spending the rest of your life being invisible in a business you helped create. Don't let anyone convince you that demanding recognition for your contributions is selfish or destructive. Creating accurate understanding of who does what in a family business isn't about taking credit from others. It's about ensuring that all contributions are valued and utilized effectively. I spent 35 years letting other people define my worth and my role. I spent 35 years believing that keeping the peace was more important than claiming my place. I spent 35 years being invisible in my own life. I'm not spending one more day that way, and neither should you. The most beautiful part of my story is that it didn't end with corporate restructuring or public recognition. It ended with relationships that are stronger, more honest, and more respectful than they've ever been. Chuck and I are better business partners now than we ever were as spouses because our collaboration is based on mutual respect rather than traditional assumptions. Jake and I have a relationship built on professional admiration, as well as family love. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to insist that they see you clearly, recognize your contributions honestly, and treat you with the respect you've earned. At 67, I wake up every morning as Dorothy Miller, founder and chairman of Miller Construction, recognized business leader, and woman who proved that it's never too late to step out of the shadows and claim your rightful place. If I can do it, so can you. The only question is, how long are you willing to wait? The next time someone tries to make you invisible in your own life, remember this story. Remember that the most revolutionary thing a woman can do is simply refuse to disappear. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing me, for hearing me, and for understanding that women like me, women like you, have been building America's businesses all along. We just haven't been getting credit for it. Until now.